Wake the fuck up, samurai. We have a city to burn.
Cyberpunk 2077 has a lot of graphics options for PC, and it's not particularly easy to run depending on your hardware. Actually, it's all hardware. It's hard to run on all hardware. But we've gone through every single graphics option. We've detailed and chronicled the visual differences between them. So we have graphics comparisons side by side, one after the other. And then we also benchmarked key options to help determine where you can find the most performance uplift for the least visual sacrifice in your Cyberpunk 2077 PC settings. So that's what we're going to be going through today. It's a massive settings guide, and it took the whole team about a week to complete. Before that, this video is brought to you by Drop and the new Drop Enter mechanical keyboard. The Drop Enter 10 keyless mechanical keyboard uses an aluminum housing underside to provide rigidity when typing, and topside, it uses smooth gator on yellow or tactile Halo True switches. Drop offers this smaller keyboard in black, white, and two-tone black-green, and calls it a beginner mechanical keyboard for soon-to-be enthusiasts. Learn more at the link in the description below. So first of all, even if you're not interested in Cyberpunk 2077, a lot of the stuff in this guide still applies mostly universally to games because the game graphics options more or less mean the same thing from one to the next. So you can still learn a lot in here about how the game graphics are interpreted by the hardware and what kind of impact those settings generally have on the performance, whether they're CPU bound or GPU bound, for example. There's a lot of work involved in doing this type of content piece, and it's not possible to fit literally everything into one video and have it be reasonable. So we have a separate video on DLSS that's already live. You should absolutely look at that. DLSS is the #1 place to go for graphics quality improvement without much sacrifice if you have a card that can run it. It has to be an RTX card. That's the one hang up. If you don't have one of those, then, well, you might as well ignore that piece unless you want to just learn about it. Now, second thing is we have separate benchmarks for CPUs and GPUs, including a patch 1.05 follow-up and the hex edit mods, which ended up doing about the same thing. So if you want the full suite of a whole bunch of different components, check those content pieces if you're trying to figure out what to buy or upgrade to. This one, however, is working more off of simply a delta between graphics setting A versus B, leaving all other things completely controlled so that we can see where is the most improvement gained by dropping settings versus where should you just max them out and leave them alone because they don't really change at all, like typically anisotropy filtering, for example. To give you an idea for the time involved in this one, it took 2 people, so it took Patrick and Andrew about 1 week each of work, several days of work each, just to go through all the settings and do visual comparisons and do benchmarks. And then I put in time on the CPU benchmarks and the GPU and CPU benchmark scripting, went through the scripting on this. So it was a full team effort. Keegan's been editing it all day. Not an easy video to make. And you can always support us on patreon.com/gamersnexus or store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to pick up one of our wireframe mouse mats, mod mats, or other items if you want to support this type of work. The organization for the settings that we're going through will be by greatest FPS impact first. The goal for this guide is to help you determine where you don't mind losing some visual quality in favor of more frame rate to hit your FPS targets. We'll first talk about what the setting is, show examples of it, and then show you benchmarks for that setting, and we'll make some recommendations on what we think you should do with that setting for different types of hardware. We actually got our start in doing these types of guides for GTA 5 and The Witcher 3 years and years ago. We've done them for Destiny and for Overwatch, but it's been a little while, and this one is a huge one to start with. So let's get into it and start talking about some of the most impactful graphics settings to tune in Cyberpunk. One of the most noticeable settings is related to reflections. The game offers control over ray traced reflections and over screen space reflections, or SSR. The SSR setting includes options for off, low, medium, high, ultra, and psycho, which is not activated under any of the presets and has to be manually done. Psycho is only available for a couple of the settings options in the game. We'll go through these levels of reflection side by side as this section is discussed. The differences between these options is large, but obviously requires a reflection to see, so you won't see it everywhere. Rainfall, bodies of water, shallow or deep, and reflective surfaces other than activated mirrors will show the graphics quality changes from this setting. Mirrors, however, are controlled by a separate quality setting in the game's graphics menu. Screen space awareness is an old, simple concept of applying the setting, reflections in this case, only to objects within screen space. Objects and meshes which exit the view frustum, like those behind the player or even the front of the player's character, would not be reflected in screen space reflections. This is the reason that mirrors in games often reflect the back of the character, or don't reflect the character at all. Since the front isn't seen, at least not in this example, it isn't rendered, and more primitive SSR won't work to reflect an unrendered object. You could get around this with planar reflections, which we've used Unreal Engine to demonstrate before. These aren't ray tracing, but they are expensive. You could also use ray trace reflections. Developers can use environment maps or other hacks to fake reflections of off-screen objects as well, in a fixed location object like a mirror. Overall, RT reflections are more technically detailed and can be more accurate, and they're certainly easier to implement in one aspect, which is that it works a specific way and doesn't require a bunch of hacking and trickery on the developer's side. But players using the Psycho or Ultra setting would still get a good reflection experience if running on non-RT hardware or trying to save performance. Some players may even prefer the more blurred, abstract reflections with SSR. We'll show a benchmark chart in a moment with all the different settings. The testing was done with a baseline of 1440p high textures, and high crowd density, with the only setting being changed being the reflection quality, and the render mode, obviously, if it's ray traced. We use the Arasaka lobby, which we've been showing for a moment, for this test sequence. This is more heavily populated with reflections than what might be experienced during daytime street wandering, but it would be comparable once you add the aftermath of a rainstorm or get near water or reflective buildings, all of which are ever present in the game. This building is encountered early on and makes it an easy test sequence. This room is using a reflection capture to build a texture of its environment that appears when the reflections are even disabled. But the lights down the hallway use screen space reflections or RT reflections. The fluorescent tube lights in the overhang near the wall appear pre-baked as well, but there's clearly a lot of reflection off of the floor. In fact, returning to the start of the benchmark, you can see the screen space reflection wipe and load when we look up or down. That's screen space awareness in action. Here's the chart. In testing, we found the baseline performance of high to run at 74.7 FPS average in this environment. Lows in this set of tests were more consistent than in tests we ran closer to launch. Completely disabling reflections brought us to 86 FPS average, establishing a min to max range of about 14 FPS for SSR, a massive 19% maximum improvement by turning it off versus Ultra. Adding Psycho widens that range to 75% uplift from disabling the setting altogether. If, however, you wanted a compromise, SSR Low still gives some reflections while costing 5% performance. The medium setting costs an additional 4.6%. This is in a reflections-heavy environment, mind you, but you'll encounter those somewhat regularly in Cyberpunk, especially with weather changes. Moving to RT reflections just costs a couple of FPS more than SSR Psycho, but a whole lot more than Ultra. That's when using a 3060 Ti, mind you. The influence here will vary based on the silicon you're using, since the RT cores scale with the silicon. The next section will cover Cyberpunk's ray-traced graphics options in greater detail, including benchmarks and comparisons. This one will take more time because of how many options there are for RT in this game, and it's made more complex by the overlapping network of which options override each other. Of course, timestamps are available if you'd like to skip to the non-RT stuff. Cyberpunk's 3 RT graphics options, lighting, shadows, and reflections, are easily the most impactful in terms of performance, and in some cases, arguably for visuals, at least on the NVIDIA GPUs that currently allow the use. No word yet on when Cyberpunk's RT will run on AMD cards, but the company has said it's working with AMD on implementation. We've already covered the simplest of these settings, which is reflections, and we have a completely different standalone piece on DLSS. So, we'll start with RT shadows for this section. Like reflections, this is a simple on-off toggle. The most important thing to note with this setting is that it only applies to light from the sun and the moon, and therefore should have no effect indoors or even outdoors with shadows cast by artificial light sources. It also doesn't affect ambient occlusion in any way, which falls under the RT lighting option. We used an outdoor scene for testing RT shadows, since that's the only place they exist. Driving down the hallway at the beginning of the Nomad path averaged 57 FPS with the RT effect enabled, while disabling it and using the unmodified 1440p high preset resulted in a 68 FPS baseline average. That's a 19% improvement. This area is covered by shrubs and cacti, casting shadows in strong sunlight, so it's ideal for stress testing the shadow settings. Again, it's really important to remember that no part of that 19% improvement will apply to any area without outdoor lighting. RT lighting is a slider rather than a toggle, and it controls several effects at once. It can be set to medium, ultra, or psycho. At the highest level, psycho, ray traced global illumination, or GI, is enabled for sunlight, allowing a single light bounce off of exposed surfaces that tints the surroundings with the reflected color. Psycho isn't part of the stock presets, which only go up to ultra. Ambient occlusion and diffuse illumination are controlled by the same slider at all levels. Diffuse illumination is cast from the usual emissive lights, like light bulbs and neon signs, but also by the entire sky in outdoor scenes to represent scattered sunlight. This is separate from the direct sunlight reflected by RT global illumination. Going from medium to ultra brightens some areas, potentially by allowing additional lighting bounces, but there's little visible difference otherwise. Ultra is more true to life, but in complex scenes like the interior of the Coyote Bar, it's already difficult to mentally track what light should be bounced where. Without side-by-side comparisons, it would be hard to say which is more accurate. Light bouncing has to do with the diffuse illumination part of RT lighting. Ray-traced ambient occlusion is also enabled at both medium and ultra, but there's no obvious change in AO quality between the two settings. We'll cover what ambient occlusion is in more detail later on, but it essentially fills in corners and crevices that aren't fully darkened by individually cast shadows, and more on that in a moment. We used the same outdoor driving scene as our primary test for this setting, since that's where all three elements of RT lighting can come into play, specifically GI, as well as diffuse illumination from the sky dome. At Psycho, with global illumination enabled, average FPS was 43, a 9% improvement up to 47 FPS average at Ultra. With GI out of the way, scaling from Ultra to Medium was less dramatic, rising to just 50 FPS average. Again, baseline for this test with no RT effects was 68 FPS, 38% beyond performance with the minimum level of RT lighting, and 57% beyond the maximum. One odd feature of the Cyberpunk graphics menu is that a separate option just called ray tracing must be enabled in order to unlock the group of RT settings, but each sub-item in this group can be disabled. We did one benchmark pass to see whether just enabling RT without enabling any of the individual effects would do anything, and it didn't. Average FPS in our standard test area was 66.1 versus 66.7 baseline, so that's well within variance. In reading through the review materials for Cyberpunk, one thing we were struck by was how many of the in-game graphics options are overridden by the 3 RT options, especially the multitude of shadow-related settings. Even though each RT option fully replaces at least one non-RT effect, the non-RT options remain open and changeable when RT is toggled on. We decided to enable ray tracing, so RT reflections on shadows and RT lighting ultra, and do some A/B testing with a group of potentially overwritten settings, maximized and minimized, to see whether they still affect performance behind the scenes. Using RT with all the related non-RT settings maxed out averaged 30 FPS. With those same non-RT settings minimized, the average is 30.5. So a 2% difference, which is potentially slight scaling, but not enough to really be certain. It's probably the same, is the takeaway. The second area we chose was indoors, in the Arasaka lobby. Here, average FPS went from 32 to 33, so that's a 5% difference when not rounding the FPS averages. This is outside of the run-to-run variance as well. Performance shows more scaling indoors than out because, again, RT shadows are only applied in sunlight and moonlight. For example, contact shadows appear both indoors and outdoors when enabled, but with RT shadows enabled, they're completely replaced outdoors and still appear in artificial indoor lighting. Although this indoor scene is still heavily affected by RT reflections and lighting, RT shadows are completely absent, and therefore the non-RT shadow settings take effect instead. Players should be aware that these settings, and others like RTGI, are context sensitive and will affect some areas much more than others. The next one we'll talk about is crowd density. This setting is of mixed impact. There isn't much change for GPU-bound scenarios, because you're bound probably by something else first, but there is one for CPUs under load, and we'll look at that shortly. Crowd density clearly has an impact on the number of NPCs visible at any given time in Night City, and this is also one of the settings that, even though it can have a big impact on performance, should probably be left alone as long as possible, as high as possible. The game is predicated on the idea of a populous, crowded city, and reducing this setting has a disproportionately high influence on the atmosphere of the game. In our comparison footage, you can see a sharp contrast in crowd density between low and high. And in testing it, we noticed that crowd density mostly seems to affect the spawn rate of people the furthest away first, then the lowest setting affects people close by. You'll notice pop-in and spawning of people occasionally, closer by especially as you approach the spawn points, whereas higher settings will spawn those NPCs typically before it's as noticeable. The game feels a lot more dead with the setting reduced. This is naturally a geometry-heavy setting, since more NPCs means more complex geometry, but it can become a CPU-bound setting by nature of all the AI and pathfinding that gets processed for each NPC. Although not formally a benchmark, we did a quick hand count of NPC presence in a marketplace for comparison. This was done with a few loads and attempts. On average, at the starting point of our market walkthrough, we noticed approximately 36 to 38 NPCs visible in a single freeze frame at the entrance to the market when set to high settings. Changing to low reduced that to about 16 to 17 NPCs, and that's just the visible ones, obviously. It also noticeably changed when the NPCs appear in terms of walking through and their proximity to you when they materialize out of thin air. A reduction of 20 visible NPCs in a single scene is a big visual change to how the scene feels and what the atmosphere of the game is like, but it also helps to explain the CPU performance gains from that reduction. In GPU testing and using our standard test path along a city sidewalk, we found that the rest of the game's baseline 1440p high settings dictated performance more than crowd density. Crowd density changes had no greater impact than 0.5 FPS average when GPU bound, which is within error. And that's because there are other, more taxing settings that limit performance before crowd density. Now, if you loosen everything else and leave this high, it might start to have more of an influence from a GPU bind. But let's switch over to an R3 3300X CPU chart. The difference becomes much more pronounced when tested in the same area under the same conditions, except with this CPU instead. Baseline high plotted 89 FPS average, with lows at 58 and 47 for 1% and 0.1%. This didn't change much when we moved to a low LOD while keeping crowd density high, but more on that later. Changing to low crowd density, performance improved by 21%, up to 107 FPS average, with lows also improving in step with the average. If you're CPU bound, or if your CPU is significantly outclassed by your GPU, then this setting would be worth looking at. The next setting is volumetric cloud quality and resolution. This changes the density of the clouds in the sky. The denser they are, the more ray march steps are needed to count through them. This is one of the most intensive settings in the game after reflections. But much like reflections, its impact is contingent on the environment. The inside of buildings won't see any benefit from changing the setting. And downtown Night City has enough of a skyline obscuring the sky that it won't benefit as much as the outer limits of the city. For this one, we tested in the Nomad environment near some of the telecom towers, and that's outside the city. So the sky was filled with clouds. This is the maximum area of impact that we could find for this one setting. This setting starts at low, but it does have an off version as well. With off used, no clouds appeared in the sky ever, not even a simple skybox texturing of them. Moving from off to low has a big visual impact, and we'd recommend at least running on low if you can support it. There aren't any clouds with it off, and so that's a change that becomes visually noticeable. From low to high, there's minimal visual impact to the player. Increasing the settings increases the density of the clouds, but it's unlikely you'd ever notice this during actual gameplay, especially in the city. We noticed that the shape and quantity of the clouds stays exactly the same as well. You can even reload a save, and it won't change, assuming at least you're on the same game launch. Volumetric cloud systems use ray marching to approximate light scattering, cloud self-shadowing, and multiple scattering. Although Cyberpunk doesn't use Unreal Engine, the Unreal Engine documentation does a good job of explaining cloud behavior. Quote, in a cloud, the droplets that make up the cloud usually lead to an albedo that is close to a value of 1, meaning that light is almost never absorbed within a volume. Light that is not absorbed passes through the volume, making the scattering effect very complex in the process. The multiple scattering effect of the participating media affects light travel through the cloud volume. It's what makes them look bright, while also appearing very thick. Baseline performance had us at 72 FPS average, while moving to ultra cloud quality from high cost us an additional 5.6% of our total performance, or about 4 FPS. That's a big impact for one tick of movement in a single setting, and ultra isn't particularly worthwhile if you're trying to find a few places to gain a couple FPS. That's particularly true if you have issues outside of the city. Disabling volumetric clouds entirely climbs to 78 FPS average, a boost of 8% from baseline to high. Medium basically runs at the same FPS as high. We'd recommend running high rather than ultra, depending on how close your FPS is to your target. Disabling them entirely is more noticeable than changing the settings to the lowest value, but it also provides one of the largest FPS boosts outside of reflections when measured from baseline to high. And again, just like reflections, these gains are variable based on the environment. There's no easy use this setting everywhere for the best looks and the best performance, because it depends where you are. If there aren't any clouds in an area, then that area won't benefit much or at all from reducing or disabling this setting. Whereas with SSR, if there's nowhere for reflections to appear, that setting and its different options won't change the performance as much as maybe cloud quality would. The next one is for volumetric fog resolution. There are a few places where we thought this setting might take effect, but it actually did nothing, and then there are some where it really obviously takes effect. One example of a place where there was no impact would be the sprite-based smoke, which is coming out of vents all across the city. It's totally unaffected by volumetrics. It's just a sprite, after all, and there was no smoke simulation to be had in several areas of the game where smoke is conveyed. If you watch the smoke emitted from the vents, it's clear that it follows a pattern. It loops, and on closer inspection, it is just a simple sprite, or alpha texture. The smoke sprites also follow the camera as the player moves, pivoting about the axis. This is an ancient approach to smoke and fog, and it's probably familiar to everybody watching. You might remember it, for example, in any version of Counter-Strike with smoke grenades. Instead of affecting these parts of the game, volumetric fog resolution, the setting, actually increases the grid density allowed for volumetric calculations. Most of the smoke and steam effects are ultimately sprite-based, and those are unaffected by this setting. But fog within smoky bars does get affected by the setting. We think this setting has a medium visual impact and a moderate performance impact. Set to low, volumetric fog resolution does some weird things. It creates a blocky fog, but it's not apparent everywhere. If you look at the light in the zoomed in shot, you'll see that there's clearly a grid that gets affected by the setting. In Unreal Engine, this is a grid size that is traced through the whole world in 3D space, which is then used to calculate fog. As fog resolution increases, the grid space becomes higher density. You can see this in the apparent pixel density in the fog obscuring the light. And again, this isn't Unreal Engine, but a lot of this stuff shares the basics. This isn't everywhere, of course. A lot of the street lamps aren't affected by volumetric fog at all. We think it's situational based on where fog is placed in the game. We haven't played through the whole game beyond benchmarking it for over 100 hours on all of our accounts at this point, but if there are any weather events where fog rolls through the city, for example, we'd expect those to make use of this setting. Our benchmark scene for this involved a smoky shop vendor stall in the street market. There's volumetric fog present in the scene, and the lighting interactions in the scene create a GPU-intensive workload. Our baseline 1440p high setting ran at 67 FPS average, obviously without the recommended aid of DLSS, and it gained about 6 FPS average, or 8.5%, when going from high to low. The medium setting leans closer to low in FPS than high, running at 72 while increasing in the apparent grid density. Going to ultra cost us an additional 2 FPS average over the high setting, or about 2.7% of the baseline performance. If you're desperate for frame rate, particularly in these night market areas, if you experience more lag here, volumetric fog resolution has a meaningful impact, if not already at medium or low, with crowd density being the setting of choice for those in a CPU bind. We'd recommend medium as a quick way to gain a couple percent performance improvement if you're struggling to find settings to tune. Going to low starts to become blockier in some spots of fog, and thus more obvious of a settings reduction. Ambient occlusion is the next setting. This one has a medium impact on performance, but it's immediately noticeable in the game's visuals. Ambient occlusion changes how much nearby surfaces will occlude light from each other. The higher the setting, the further out each surface will look compared to nearby surfaces. This setting is overwritten by the ray-traced lighting option, but not ray-traced shadows. Ambient occlusion isn't new, and it works the same way in this game as it does everywhere else. The difference in this bar scene makes it clear that moving between off and low has a huge visual impact, as the shading at object edges is more accurate and more accurately reflects potential occlusions nearby. If you look at the top of the fridge behind the counter, the shading between the shelf and the fridge becomes more exaggerated with each setting's increase. So this is something where we can actually easily see the difference all the way up to the maximum setting. AO is typically done in screen space, and that's what's happening here, SSAO, for example. But there's also a ray traced option that changes the render mode to ray tracing. Clearly, this increases the accuracy of the AO in the scene, and although there's clearly a visual difference in Cyberpunk when we toggle between RTAO and SSAO, it might actually be easiest to use an Unreal Engine documentation example to show the differences. In this demo scene, you can see how the plant on the right side, the table leg in the center, and the lamp get fairly even shadows around the full object with SSAO, and that's regardless of how close they are to walls or other surfaces. With ray tracing, we can now account for cold objects and for unseen objects, and so the universal shadows that surround the entire object get dropped in favor of more accuracy instead. For a benchmark, we used our standard CPU and GPU bench scene. Baseline was 67 FPS average when running medium, jumping to high 87% of our total performance, which is a huge drop. Deactivating AO completely brings it to 68 FPS average, 2.4% increase from medium. As for low, that's within error of the baseline medium setting, and so they're functionally the same in performance. We'd recommend using AO on at least low. It doesn't need to be maxed out for a good experience, but the visual change between off and low is immediately noticeable. We couldn't measure any meaningful change in performance between low and medium, with both at 66 to 67 FPS average. So medium seems like it should be the default for most people since it doesn't really move the bar. Because RT-AO can't be toggled without also toggling RT lighting, it isn't possible to do a true AB benchmark with just RT-AO. For this setting though, like in most games, AO at medium seems like a safe middle ground. For all these thus far, we've had the texture quality set to high, but that's because it doesn't really affect anything unless you're limited on VRAM. We'll run some side-by-side comparisons between high, medium, and low. With a shot staring at our own feet, you can see the differences in texture detail immediately apparent in the player's shoes, the curb, and the red wall. These are especially noticeable between high and low, but medium is also visibly worse than high in some places. The below deck poster especially loses a significant amount of detail when set to low. It loses so much that on the right side of the poster, the text becomes illegible on low, while high and medium options remain clear or mostly legible. The vending machine also has clear differences. Mesh detail is clearly unaffected, and texture detail on the lower panels is fine, but we lose all of the legibility on the left side for the numerical labels, and the burrito, or whatever it is, has become completely unidentifiable. Finally, for the dumpster, there's an expected loss of texture grittiness in the painted surface, and a similar loss of quality in the text printed on the side of the dumpster. Because there's basically no FPS impact, you can choose this option based on if you're having VRAM issues. Remember though that running GPU-Z or other logging tools won't tell you the actual VRAM utilization. The thing to look for would be hard frame time spikes, big stutters, particularly when entering new areas. Now, even though VRAM measurements only show the allocation and not necessarily the actual utilization, it can still be useful to run a VRAM log for determining the behavioral differences in said allocation. We'll start with textures at low. GPU memory utilization in this chart started at about 4,300 megabytes on the first test pass, and as the game loaded and cached, that climbed to 4,700 megabytes on subsequent tests. Again, this doesn't mean it's actually necessarily using that much VRAM, but this is the closest we can get to any form of video memory consumption number without internal NVIDIA or AMD tools. The medium textures option plotted just above at 4,600 megabytes, and then 4,900 megabytes after a few passes. Finally, the high textures option started much higher at 5,400 megabytes allocated, and then it climbed to about 5,900 megabytes allocated on subsequent passes. It's possible that there would be some additional climbing in other areas of the game, or with longer play sessions. Choose this one based on VRAM availability and potential hard hitches if you're running a card with less memory when loading and purging areas of the game. But the FPS in a loaded area will be largely unaffected other than potentially a large frame time spike if you have insufficient video memory. Shadow quality is next. The non-RTX shadows in the game aren't impressive, but they get the job done. It's just fairly standard. The game has a lot of shadow options, including these: local shadow mesh quality, local shadow quality, cascaded shadow range, cascaded shadow resolution, distant shadow resolution, contact shadows, and RTX shadows, which we already discussed. Going through them as quickly as we can, here's the breakdown. Local shadow mesh quality can be thought of as an LOD setting, except for shadows. It affects the detail of mesh being referenced to create the shadow, but not the actual 3D object itself. This does not have any effect for meshes lit by artificial light, and in our comparison we have a shot of a green barrier at a crosswalk on the street. The green barrier object itself never changes, but at low settings, you can see some of the geometry lose its shadow on the ground. This is the most obvious depiction of local shadow mesh quality that we captured. Local shadow quality, the next one, does not affect objects lit by sunlight, only those lit by artificial light. It's for the effective resolution of shadows nearby. In some scenes, we saw no difference between low and medium, so it could be that each object is set to operate differently for each setting, and maybe the ones in our test scene happen to be the same on low and medium. The next one is Cascaded Shadow Range, and it's for specific types of high-quality shadows that are cast based on the direction of the lights. This one seems to affect the quality per unit of distance. Lower settings beget lower quality sooner, relative to the player's location, and higher settings result in higher quality sooner. This is highly noticeable in certain environments, like the middle of the desert, and isn't noticeable at all in close-range environments, like the densest parts of the city or indoors. This setting is fairly linear in distance cutoffs between high, medium, and low, and it changes the distance from the player at which dynamic shadows are drawn. Cascaded shadow resolution is used for the quality of the cascaded shadows described a moment ago, so that's simple. The next one is distant shadow resolution, which is literal. It's for shadows at a distance, and it appears to be changing the resolution of those shadows. We have footage of the range, but no real unit of measurement. We were able to use crosswalk lines on the ground to help measure some points of distance, but it's a literal option. Contact shadows are also literal. They're affected by sunlight and artificial light. This adds shadows for parts of the mesh that are close to each other, and also parts of the mesh that are closest to the ground. The main focus for this is often characters, where contact shadows are cast upon the upper body or under the brow or eye area. In these areas, light might not have enough definition to cast an accurate shadow, so calculating the mesh's features relative to itself and where the light is can create sharper shadows where light should be casting those shadows. If it had higher definition, that is. And then for the shadow benchmarks, here's some quick charts. In our normal test area, the baseline setting ran 66 FPS average. Enabling contact shadows dropped us to 64 FPS average from 66, with another 2 FPS drop following a local shadow mesh quality hike to high. In the next chart, testing cascaded shadows in the desert from atop a telecom tower, we noticed a maximum range of 3 FPS average. Setting cascaded shadow resolution to high ran at 67 FPS average, with medium at about 70, baseline at 70, and then low at about 71. Anisotropic filtering is typically low impact in games, and that continues here. This one is most often presented as a numerical value, like 1, 2, 4, 8, or 16, with a numerical value representing the number of samples per pixel. Anisotropic filtering helps with textures presented at glancing angles, especially those on the ground, like roads or grates, and the angle would be relative to the player's camera. Anisotropic filtering above 1 seems to get almost exponentially less noticeable in this game, where differences from boosting to 8 or 16 are difficult to notice in this 4K capture. Our exterior scene with the metal grate flooring is difficult to render and shows one of the most extreme examples of AF at work. Moving from 1 tap to 4 tap AF is noticeable about mid-depth from the camera when switching between the two shots. You can see that the grill gets fuzzier, and it starts to disappear even in some spots with the lower settings. 8 to 16x, though, doesn't show much of a difference, but there's a huge jump when going from 1 to 4, and there's still some jump from 4 to 8. Our interior scene is also useful. Going from 1 to 4x AF is the most noticeable when looking about 3/4 the way down the corridor, where the texture on the floor disappears in one section altogether. Here's the benchmark chart for anisotropy in Cyberpunk 2077. This is tested in the same area as our GPU and CPU benchmarks. The only time we see an actual dip is 16x, which moves to 63.5 FPS average from the 65 to 66 range that we established before. Generally speaking, you can just set this to 16x or 8x and forget about it. The value will be higher at lower resolutions. If you see specific issues with texture quality or coherency as it gets further and further away from the camera and towards vanishing point, then this would be the one to increase if that's bothering you. The next setting is also relatively low impacts for frame rate, and it's maximum dynamic decals. This one doesn't relate to the number of bullet decals on the wall, nor does it relate to the life or the duration of those decals on the wall. This quote from CDPR says, "The max dynamic decal setting applies to decals being rendered on animated objects, like enemies. When we shoot an enemy, realistic-looking wounds start appearing on the body and the clothes. Those are all what we call dynamic decals. This setting controls how many we can have in total, as well as the max quantity of those per character. Now, this setting has absolutely no impact on the time or the life of those decals, but it's entirely to do with how many are present. We tested this on walls with standard bullet holes, since decals are often static and related to bullet holes in most games, but we noticed that the bullet holes always began disappearing at exactly the 1 minute mark. We also manually counted the bullet holes and observed no difference between the graphics settings, so the max dynamic decals definitely does not influence static decals on walls or fixed objects. In order to test this setting on enemies, Andrew spent about an hour pushing corpses around and repeatedly unloading guns into their bodies, which would probably set off alarm bells at any other company. After Andrew methodically and repeatedly murdered the same 3 NPCs, he described to me the inconvenience of running out of canvas to fill with bullet holes during testing. It's probably best that we don't talk about this specific part of our work in public. Andrew found that there's a 3 wound max per scene on the low setting with some quirks, and when asked about it, Andrew said, if you shoot one body 3 times, you can't put any more paint on the other canvases. There's about a 10 wound max on medium. Above medium, it became difficult to count the maximum wound value due to the relatively fast despawn rate of the decals. The despawn rate is exactly 10 seconds, regardless of what the setting is. It doesn't change, doesn't lengthen with the higher setting. And it's further complicated by spawn bias, where the wounds try not to spawn too close to the other wounds. You run out of space on a single person for counting, in other words. As for the earlier mentioned quirks, one of those is that the bullets that land too close together will not create new wound decals. Now, Andrew also tested this setting against skid marks from the tires, but was unable to find any difference in skid spawn rate or expiry time, and it's something that CDPR didn't allude to anyway. We're kind of surprised, actually, that this is even an option in the game, because it wouldn't have more impact than the graphics detail from the weapon itself firing, the thing causing the decal to begin with. And overall, the impact to performance is immeasurable with our test setup. Closing out then, again, DLSS is one of the #1 places to look. We have a full piece on that, not only with benchmarks, but also with a look at, for example, 1440p with higher DLSS settings, as in more aggressive DLSS settings, versus 1080p with less aggressive settings. And we look at all those in that content piece. Generally speaking, balanced or quality, you're okay, but choose between them based on the performance that you are looking for and based on the recommendations we make in the separate video. So that's first place to go if you have an RTX card. If you don't, or if you need more still, or you don't want to use DLSS, which in this game it's fine, so there really isn't a big reason to not want to use it. But either way, the next things to look at, screen space reflections for sure is one of the top items to address. Unfortunately, in Cyberpunk, each of these settings is very situational, but those situations arrive constantly. It's just they don't overlap with each other. So for screen space reflections, if there's no screen space reflections, then dropping that setting doesn't actually help you if your FPS is still low. Instead, if you're outside of the city and in the desert, you might need to drop your volumetric cloud settings, where there is actually a meaningful impact to frame rate with that setting. You shouldn't turn it off completely because it kills all the clouds, but you can run it at a lower setting and gain some FPS. It's only beneficial to you, though, when you're able to see all those clouds, when you fill the view frustum with clouds, like in the outside of the city. SSR, again, in the city or anywhere near, if there's rainfall and the road is reflective, it's very helpful there. RT settings, of course, would be one of the first to turn off if you really can't quite run it, but DLSS is intended to help balance the two. If you find yourself CPU bound, you're on an older CPU, maybe even a 3300X still new, then crowd density would be the place to go. That's the one we would like to adjust last because it's so important to the atmosphere of the game, but it gets you a lot if you're CPU bound. All the extra AI work and pathfinding causes issues on lower end CPUs. The crowd density changes don't really help that much if you're fully GPU bound. You're probably locked up on something else first. Another area of high impact other than volumetric cloud quality is the volumetric fog resolution. So when you're in later parts of the game, you're higher up in the cities and there's a lot of fog at the window. That can cause issues with lag and slowdown. That'd be the one to address for those specific scenarios. The shadow settings don't individually do a whole lot for performance. There's a little bit to be gained there. And anisotropy, like usual, has almost no impact on FPS, but can have a meaningful impact up to about 4x. Beyond that, doesn't do a whole lot. The max dynamic decals doesn't impact frame rate a whole lot. Also doesn't impact the gameplay very much, unlike some of these other settings. And that'll give you a quick recap of things. But again, we'll have additional information in the other videos on the channel, so subscribe for those. Check out the ones that are already live. We will link them all in the description below. That's it for the guide. Check us out on patreon.com/gamersnexus or store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to support us directly and get something in return. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.